So throughout this series on growing tomatoes, we've talked about what you need to be successful to have some great tomatoes in your garden. So today what we're going to do is talk about those things we learned so we can recap them, but also talk about keeping records so you know what to do next year, because I won't always be around to help you. So the first thing we talked about was starting seeds indoors. That's the best way to get the varieties that you want. Then you want to talk about using the correct soil to start them in. You want to use a soilless media that's sterile. You want to use a good light source to keep them nice and healthy and growing strong. And you also want to control the temperature. You don't want to keep them too hot or they will get leggy on you. And then we talked about, well, maybe your seed starting didn't work out so well, or you didn't have time to get that done. So we went to the store and we bought some great tomato plants from a local garden center. We talked about picking out healthy plants, ones that aren't too leggy, and picking out the right variety again. You know, we talked about all the different things that you can look for in a tomato plant, and you want to think about that whenever you're making your selection. Now, what you want to do is to keep notes on what you did throughout the season. So we have a notebook. We're going to write down the things that we grew and how we grew them, even thinking about the weather and even where we planted them. And that was the next step, where we took them out to the garden and we put them in there and we grew them successfully. So we want to write down where we planted them, because then we talked about controlling disease issues, and one of the big things is not planting them in the same place. So even drawing out a little map of your garden so you note that we planted tomatoes here this year, you don't want to plant them here again next year. Finally, we talked about what to do if your tomato has a problem. Sometimes we think everything is a disease, but it's not. And we have to figure out, is it an actual disease? Is it an insect, or is it a weather or climate related issue, which we're having a lot more of these days? So looking for those symptoms of a fungus or a bacteria, the spots that we're looking for, and then finding a way to treat them, whether it's a pesticide, an organic treatment, or a biological control. And we talked about several of those different things. Thanks to advances in modern agriculture, you can go to the grocery store and buy a tomato 365 days a year. But because they're developed for storability and not for flavor or texture, sometimes they're like eating cardboard, and you want that homegrown tomato. So you just want to throw that out and try to grow your own at home. We've talked about those steps to be helpful, and we've talked about keeping notes. So with this help, you can try and try again, because remember that it might not be successful the first time, but you get better every time because you learn from your failures. So don't be afraid to experiment in the garden and use some of the things that we talked about, because as the old song talks about, there are only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes.